The neon sign of the mid-state fuel station hummed with a persistent, buzzing flicker, casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked pavement. It was 11:43 p.m., the hour when the world outside the highway seemed to shrink into silence. Elias Thorne sat on a rusted metal crate near the back of the station, his spine slightly hunched against the biting chill of the autumn night. He was wearing an oversized, oil-stained field jacket that had seen better decades, and his beard was a tangled mess of gray and white. In his calloused hands, he held a lukewarm paper cup of convenience store coffee, the steam barely rising into the frigid air. To anyone passing by, he was invisible, just another transient soul looking for a place to rest his head away from the reach of the freezing wind. He wasn't bothering anyone. He hadn't asked for change. He was simply existing in the periphery of a world that preferred him to be elsewhere. A set of high-beam headlights sliced through the darkness, cutting across the station's lot with aggressive intensity. A black and white cruiser pulled in, engine idling with a throaty, authoritative rumble. The door opened, and Officer Marcus Miller stepped out. He was a man who wore his badge like a weapon, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the perimeter with the detached suspicion of someone who viewed the entire world as a crime scene waiting to happen. Miller didn't look at the pump displays or the empty convenience store. His gaze locked onto the figure huddled against the wall. "Hey, you!" Miller's voice tore through the silence, sharp and abrasive. He didn't approach with the caution of an officer ensuring public safety. He approached with the swagger of a man who owned the patch of earth he stood on. Elias looked up slowly. His eyes, clear and steady despite the weathering of his face, met the officer's glare. He didn't flinch. He didn't scramble to pack a bag. He simply waited. "I'm talking to you, trash!" Miller spat, his hand resting instinctively on his holster. He stopped 10 feet away, nose wrinkling as if he were standing next to an open sewer. "This is private property. Do you have a problem with reading comprehension, or do you just enjoy loitering where you aren't wanted? Move, now." Elias took a slow sip of his coffee. The heat had long since vanished, leaving only the bitter aftertaste of burnt beans. He kept his voice low, measured, and calm, a sharp contrast to the officer's explosive energy. "I'm not loitering, officer. I'm resting for a few minutes before I continue on my way. I haven't violated any laws." Miller laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He stepped closer, invading Elias's personal space. "You think you know the law? Let me tell you about the law in this county. The law is whatever I say it is, and right now, the law says you're a trespasser. You people are all the same. You sit around sucking the life out of honest businesses, waiting for a handout. You think you can just sit here, making the place look like a dump? You're an eyesore." Elias felt the familiar sting of prejudice, the kind that had been directed at him for months, ever since he had traded his tailored suits for this rough attire. But he had cultivated a deep, unbreakable patience. He knew that Miller was not just harassing a homeless man. He was exerting a power he hadn't earned over a life he didn't understand. "I have done nothing to damage this property," Elias said, his voice firming slightly. "I've purchased items inside. I am a customer, just like anyone else." Miller's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. He didn't like being challenged, especially by someone he deemed socially beneath him. He stepped in so close that Elias could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "You bought a $2 coffee, and now you think you own the lot? Don't make me laugh. Get up, now, before I decide to make your night a lot more complicated than it needs to be." Elias looked at the empty parking lot, then back to the officer. He hadn't yet revealed the truth, that this station, this land, and indeed the entire regional chain of mid-state fuel were assets he had spent 30 years building from the ground up. He was playing a game of observation, learning the character of the men who policed his properties. And so far, Miller was failing the test of human decency miserably. Miller reached down, his fingers gripping his utility belt, the leather creaking in the stillness of the night. "I'm going to ask you one more time, old man. Get off the property. If I have to tell you again, We're going to be talking about a charge of resisting an officer and public intoxication. You look like you've been drinking. I smell the rot in your pores." Elias stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. He didn't look like a man who owned the multi-million-dollar infrastructure of the mid-state chain. He looked like a weary traveler who had run out of road. "I haven't had a drop of alcohol, officer. I'm just here for a moment of peace. Surely you have bigger problems than an old man on a crate at midnight." Miller's eyes narrowed into thin, predatory slits. He stepped back, unlatching the strap on his holster just enough to signal intent, a move meant to intimidate. "Don't you talk to me about my job. You think you're smart. You think because you're graying, you're untouchable. I deal with your kind every single night. You're parasites. You come here, you trash the place, you run off the legitimate customers. I'm doing this owner a favor." Elias felt a cold, sharp anger rise in his chest. Not a hot, irrational fury, but a calculated, icy resolve. He had founded Mid-State Fuel on the principle of accessibility. He wanted his stations to be safe harbors for the weary, not exclusion zones for the marginalized. He looked up at the floodlights of the station, the bright white LEDs he had personally specified, and realized how badly his management team had failed the brand's culture, if this was the kind of behavior they encouraged from local law enforcement. "Officer," Elias said, his voice calm, "I believe you're mistaken about what the owner would want. I suspect they value a customer who treats the property with respect, regardless of what he's wearing." Miller lunged forward, the sudden movement causing his radio to crackle with static. He spun Elias around, slamming him against the rough brick wall of the convenience store. The impact knocked the breath out of Elias, and his lukewarm cup of coffee clattered to the ground, splashing brown liquid across his worn boots. "You want to lecture me on policy?" Miller growled into his ear, his grip tightening on Elias's shoulder. "I don't care what you think the owner wants. I am the authority here, and right now, the authority says you're under arrest for trespassing." Elias didn't fight back. He felt the cold concrete against his back, his mind racing not with fear, but with the stark clarity of a man who held all the cards and was watching his opponent burn his own house down. He looked toward the security camera mounted above the pump, a high-definition unit he'd installed himself. He knew exactly where the footage went. He knew exactly who would be watching it in the morning, and he knew that Officer Marcus Miller had just made the biggest, most expensive mistake of his life. Miller's grip on Elias's shoulder was bruising. The officer's face was inches from his own, eyes wide with the adrenaline of a bully who believed he had absolute impunity. "You're done, old man. Resisting an officer, public intoxication, trespassing. I'll make sure you don't see daylight for a week. Maybe then you'll learn who holds the power in this town." Elias didn't struggle. He didn't scream or beg. He simply looked past Miller's shoulder toward the security camera that blinked a steady, rhythmic red. He knew the software behind that lens. It was proprietary, linked directly to the regional cloud he monitored from his office in the city. He could see the feed right now on his encrypted tablet if he wanted to, but he didn't need to. He knew exactly what the footage would show. A law enforcement officer escalating a non-violent encounter into a physical assault. "Officer Miller," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying a strange, resonant authority that momentarily made Miller pause. "Before you process an arrest that will undoubtedly end your career, I suggest you take your hand off my shoulder." Miller laughed, though it sounded forced, a nervous tremor underneath the bluster. "Career? You think you're in a position to threaten me? You're a bum living on a crate behind a gas station. You're lucky I haven't cuffed you already." "I am not a bum," Elias stated, finally meeting Miller's eyes with a steely, unyielding gaze. "I am Elias Thorne, and you are standing on a property that I own, not just this lot. The station, the inventory inside, the land underneath your feet, and, by extension, the contract for police patrol services that your department signed with my company 3 years ago." Miller stiffened. The arrogance that had fueled his movements seconds ago wavered, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. He looked at Elias's stained jacket, then back to the confident, unshakable expression on the older man's face. "You're crazy," Miller muttered, though he loosened his grip just enough for Elias to adjust his stance. "You're delusional. This is just a gas station. The owners are a corporate entity. You're nothing." "Corporate entities have names, officer," Elias said, his voice dropping into a register that commanded total silence. "And they have rules. Rules that are currently being broadcast to a high-resolution server in the mid-state corporate headquarters. You didn't just harass a transient, Miller. You assaulted a citizen on private property without cause, and you did it on camera." Miller stepped back, his hand dropping to his side, his radio crackling with routine dispatch chatter that sounded suddenly distant. The reality of the situation began to settle in, not as a physical threat, but as a legal one. He looked at the camera again. The red light seemed to be staring directly into his soul, recording every word, every aggressive motion, every violation of protocol. Elias didn't look triumphant. He looked tired. He reached into his deep pocket, his movements slow and practiced, as if he were pulling out a weapon. Miller flinched, his hand flying to his holster. "Easy," Elias whispered. He pulled out a small, sleek black phone, not a cheap burner. He tapped the screen, and the station's exterior floodlights, which had been set to motion sensor mode, suddenly flared to full, blinding intensity, turning the parking lot into a stage. The harsh floodlights cast Miller into a sharp, uncompromising silhouette against the station's brick facade. He raised a hand to shield his eyes, the sudden transition from the gloom of the parking lot to the artificial daylight disorienting him. For a split second, the bully vanished, replaced by a man who realized, perhaps for the first time in his career, that he might be standing on ground that could swallow him whole. "Turn those off," Miller barked, though the command lacked its previous venom. He squinted at Elias, who stood perfectly still, his posture no longer that of a downtrodden transient, but of a man accustomed to command. Elias did not move. He kept his hand on the phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, maintaining the high-intensity illumination. "I'm afraid I can't do that, officer. Not while you're conducting an official investigation that seems to involve assault and intimidation. I want every second of this recorded. The lighting is simply for the sake of clarity." Miller shifted his weight, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. The bravado he had worn like armor was beginning to crack. He looked toward his cruiser, then back at the convenience store window, where he could see a night shift clerk watching, phone already in hand, likely recording the scene. The realization that he wasn't just losing an argument, he was losing his narrative, began to dawn on him. "You're playing a dangerous game," Miller growled, taking a cautious step back. "You think you're smart because you know how to operate a security system? That doesn't make you the law. I'm the one with the badge. I'm the one who decides who gets to stand on this concrete. And that is exactly why you're about to lose that badge," Elias replied, his voice devoid of anger, which made it all the more terrifying. He reached into his jacket, and Miller's hand went back to his holster in a reflex. But Elias didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a thick, laminated ID badge, a high-level security clearance for the Mid-State Corporate Executive Board. He didn't hand it to Miller. He held it up so the camera mounted above the pump could clearly capture the details. "My name is Elias Thorne. I own the Mid-State fuel chain. My legal team is currently being alerted. By the time the sun rises, there won't just be an internal complaint filed against you. There will be a civil rights lawsuit, a criminal inquiry into your conduct, and a formal petition to the police commission to review every arrest you've made in this district over the last 6 months. Miller froze. The air around them seemed to grow heavy, the silence of the night returning to press in on the space between them. The officer's chest rose and fell rapidly, the adrenaline spiking, not with violence this time, but with the cold realization of his own professional extinction. He looked at the old man, seeing past the grime and the faded jacket, seeing the eyes of a man who had built an empire from the ground up and knew exactly how to dismantle a threat. You can walk away right now, Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper. You can get in your car, drive back to the precinct, and pretend this never happened. Or you can stay here, wait for my lawyers, and explain to your sergeant why you decided to assault the owner of the very company that pays for your department's fuel contracts. Miller stared at him, the silence stretching out like a tightrope. He looked at his cruiser, then at the camera, then back at Elias. The power dynamic had shifted violently and permanently. The silence in the parking lot was absolute, broken only by the hum of the cooling pumps and the distant, rhythmic ticking of the traffic signal at the highway intersection. Miller, a man who had spent his entire career believing that a badge was a magic wand that erased reality, finally felt the crushing weight of his uniform. He wasn't looking at a transient anymore. He was looking at a man who was meticulously dismantling his life, one word at a time. I have a department to answer to, Miller stammered, his voice lacking the sharp, command-ready edge it had possessed just moments before. He shifted his stance, looking for an exit, not a physical one, but a logical one. You can't just throw your weight around because you own a few pumps. This is official business. I was responding to a report of suspicious activity. Elias Thorne didn't blink. He stood with the unshakable calm of a man who had sat on boards of directors and negotiated multi-million-dollar acquisitions. He watched the sweat bead on Miller's forehead, not with pity, but with the dispassionate observation of a man assessing a failing asset. A report from whom, officer? Elias asked, his tone deceptively gentle. The station clerk, who has been watching this entire interaction from behind the bulletproof glass. Or perhaps the security footage that shows you initiated physical contact without a single word being exchanged. Miller opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The logic trap was set, and he had walked straight into it. He was a veteran of the streets, but he had never faced a defendant who knew how to argue the law with the precision of a prosecutor. I didn't mean for this to, Miller started, then stopped, realizing he was dangerously close to an admission of guilt. He tried to reclaim his posture, straightening his back, but his uniform felt heavy, a costume that no longer fit the scene. Look, let's just call this a misunderstanding. I'll clear the lot. You go back to whatever it is you do, and we'll call it a night. No reports, no lawsuits, no mess. Elias stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Miller's. A misunderstanding? You threatened a man's freedom, assaulted him on his own property, and abused the authority granted to you by the tax-paying citizens of this county. That isn't a misunderstanding, officer. That is a violation of the public trust. Just then, a pair of headlights swept into the lot, distinct from the patrol car. A dark, sleek SUV glided to a stop, not with the aggressive rush of the police cruiser, but with the quiet, expensive precision of a vehicle carrying high-level legal counsel. The driver's side door opened, and a man in a sharp, charcoal-gray suit stepped out. Not a police officer, but an attorney Elias kept on a permanent retainer for exactly these types of corporate disputes. Miller watched the newcomer with a growing sense of dread. The game had ended. The trial had begun. The man who stepped out of the dark SUV was David Sterling, a name that carried as much weight in the regional legal circles as Elias Thorne's did in the fuel industry. He didn't look at Miller with hostility. He looked at him with the clinical indifference of a surgeon preparing to excise a tumor. He held a leather-bound briefcase in one hand and a mobile phone in the other, which was still recording the audio of the exchange. "Officer," Sterling said, his voice smooth and polished, cutting through the tense atmosphere of the gas station lot. "I'm David Sterling, legal counsel for Midstate Fuel. My client, Mr. Thorne, has just informed me of your current investigation. Perhaps you could clarify the probable cause for your physical detainment of a private citizen on private property." Miller's face turned from a flush crimson to a sickly, pale gray. He knew that name. Every officer in the county knew the name Sterling. He was the man who had dismantled the municipal police union's budget defense during the high-profile 2022 corruption trials. I was responding to a disturbance," Miller stuttered, his hand hovering nervously near his belt, unsure whether to reach for his cuffs or his radio. He was trespassing, refusing to leave. I had to ensure the safety of the premise. "The premise is owned by the man you have pinned against the wall," Sterling said, his tone sharpening. He stepped forward, entering the floodlit circle of light. "I have the security logs for this location. We have the time-stamped video feed of you approaching Mr. Thorne without any provocation, engaging in verbal harassment, and initiating unprovoked physical contact. Do you understand the liability you've just placed on yourself and your department, officer?" Elias stepped away from the wall, brushing the dust from his shoulder. He didn't look like a victim anymore. He looked like a CEO who had just found a faulty component in his assembly line and was deciding how to replace it. "You have exactly 2 minutes to decide how this night ends, Officer Miller," Elias said, his voice calm and cold. "You can leave your badge, your duty belt, and your firearm on the hood of your cruiser, walk off this property, and resign before the sun rises. If you do that, I will instruct my counsel to treat this as a private matter of professional misconduct rather than a criminal assault and civil rights violation." Miller stared at them, his chest heaving. The choice was agonizing. To strip off his gear was to admit everything, to surrender the only identity he had ever known. But the alternative, to wait for the formal reports, the internal affairs investigation, the inevitable firing, and the lawsuits that would bankrupt him, was a catastrophe. "You can't do this," Miller whispered, the bravado completely stripped away. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job is to protect and serve, not to abuse and intimidate," Sterling replied, holding up his phone. "We have the footage, we have the audio, and I have the chief of police on speed dial, who is currently waiting for me to hit send on an email that will detail every second of this incident. The clock is ticking, officer." Miller looked at his patrol car. The flashing lights, once a symbol of his authority, now looked like a flashing neon sign pointing directly at his impending downfall. He looked at Elias Thorne, the homeless man who was now the most powerful person in the county, and realized that in his search for a target to bully, he had walked into the jaws of a lion. The silence was deafening, amplified by the rhythmic pulsing of the patrol car's light bar. Miller's hands trembled, not with the adrenaline of a fight, but with the cold, creeping dread of an ending. He had spent years wrapped in the perceived invulnerability of the badge, believing it was a shield that could deflect any scrutiny. But looking at Elias Thorne, who stood with the quiet dignity of a man who didn't need a uniform to command respect, Miller finally understood that he had been wearing a costume all along. With a slow, mechanical stiffness, Miller reached for his utility belt. The leather groaned as he unbuckled it. He placed it, along with his radio and his sidearm, on the roof of the cruiser. Each item hitting the metal sounded like a gavel strike, a finality that echoed across the desolate gas station lot. When he finally unpinned the badge from his chest, he held it in his palm for a fraction of a second, staring at the shield he had so carelessly tarnished. He set it down beside his weapon. "It's done," Miller whispered, his voice cracking. He looked at Elias, his eyes reflecting the loss of an identity he had mistaken for a purpose. "I'm turning in my resignation to the precinct by morning. I won't be back." Sterling clicked his phone off, having captured the entire confession and surrender on video. "That is the wisest decision you've ever made, officer, or should I say, Mr. Miller." Elias didn't offer any words of comfort, nor did he gloat. He simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement that the debt of his dignity had been paid. He turned his back on the now disarmed man, signaling that Miller was no longer a person of interest in his world, just a footnote in a long career of corporate management. "David, please ensure the station manager is informed of the protocol breach," Elias said, his voice flat, "and see to it that the footage is archived properly. We don't need a public spectacle, just a clean record of the facts." As Elias walked toward his own vehicle, his gait was slightly uneven, the physical reminder of the earlier struggle. He had been roughed up, treated as a threat, and humiliated, all because he chose to witness the world from the ground level. But he felt a strange sense of clarity. He had seen the ugly underbelly of the department he indirectly funded, and he knew now that the mid-state brand needed more than just better fuel. It needed a better culture of accountability. Miller stood alone in the lot, the lights of his cruiser reflecting off the empty glass of the convenience store. He felt stripped, exposed. He had expected to arrest a man that night. Instead, he had managed to arrest his own future. He walked to the driver's side door, but he didn't get in. He simply leaned against the frame, watching the SUV disappear into the night, the red taillights fading like the last embers of his career. The morning light didn't bring relief for Marcus Miller. It brought the cold, hard reality of his actions. By 8 a.m., the video file from the gas station, a high-definition, time-stamped record of his assault, was sitting on the desk of the county police chief, attached to a formal legal filing by David Sterling. It wasn't just a complaint. It was a complete dossier. It included the audio recording of Miller's threats, the video of his unprovoked aggression, and a detailed list of his previous encounters with transients at the same location, revealing a pattern of systemic harassment that had been hidden under the guise of law enforcement. Elias Thorne sat in his high-rise office, his knee still throbbing slightly where it had hit the brick wall, but his mind was clear. He had spent the early hours of the morning reviewing the station's internal management reports. He wasn't just holding the officer accountable, he was auditing his own house. The station manager, who had stood by and watched the harassment without intervening, was being suspended pending a full investigation into why the station's culture had drifted so far from the core values of the mid-state brand. "The chief is on line 2, his assistant whispered, her voice tinged with the gravity of the situation. Elias nodded, pressing the speakerphone button. "Mr. Thorne?" The chief's voice was strained, clearly aware of the political and public relations firestorm he was staring at. "I've seen the file Sterling sent over. There is no ambiguity here. Officer Miller's badge has been seized. He's been placed on immediate administrative leave, and given the evidence, we are moving to terminate his employment for cause, effective immediately. We're also cooperating fully with the district attorney's office regarding the criminal charges." "This isn't about one man, Chief," Elias said, his voice steady and devoid of malice. "It's about the climate your department allowed to fester. If Miller was comfortable acting like a predator in public, he believed he had the backing to do so. That changes today. Not just for my stations, but for every citizen who has been intimidated by the badge. I want to see a full review of the patrol protocols for the entire region." The chief hesitated, then sighed, a sound of defeat from a man realizing the old guard was losing its grip. "I understand. We're initiating a mandatory retraining program for the entire patrol division. And I want to apologize, personally. We failed our duty." Elias ended the call. He looked out his window at the city skyline. The justice he had sought wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration of order. He had been a man of power, a millionaire, but for those few minutes at the gas station, he had been treated like discarded waste. And in that moment, he had seen the system for exactly what it was. Now he was going to rebuild it, starting with the very foundation of how his company interacted with the community. The disciplinary hearing at the Riverton County Precinct was not a public affair, but the fallout was seismic. Officer Marcus Miller sat in a hard-backed chair in the chief's office, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and the palpable tension of professional decay. He was no longer wearing the uniform. He was dressed in civilian clothes, his posture slumped, the weight of the previous night's events finally manifesting as a profound, unshakable exhaustion. Chief Owen Barrett sat behind his desk, a manila folder open before him. It contained the evidence package David Sterling had delivered, the high-definition time-stamped footage from the mid-state station, the audio recording of Miller's unprovoked escalation, and the logs of every past incident where Miller had harassed transient individuals under the guise of maintaining order. "The evidence is insurmountable, Marcus," Barrett said, his voice flat. He didn't offer the comfort of an old comrade. "We've reviewed the footage. You didn't just err, you manufactured a crime where none existed. You assaulted a citizen and fabricated a trespass record to justify your own aggression. The state board has already been notified of the criminal charges pending against you." Miller didn't defend himself. He couldn't. He looked at his hands, calloused from years of gripping a steering wheel and a sidearm, and realized they were empty. "I thought I was doing what the job required," he whispered, a hollow echo of the justification he'd used for years. "The job requires service, not subjugation," Barrett retorted. "You are stripped of all law enforcement authority, effective immediately. You are barred from applying to any public safety role within the state, and the civil rights investigation into your department conduct is ongoing. You're done." While Miller was being dismantled in the precinct, the Mid-State fuel station was undergoing a transformation of its own. Elias Thorne had arrived at 7 a.m., not in a suit, but in clean, practical work clothes. He walked the lot with the station manager, who was shaking visibly. Thorne didn't yell. He didn't berate. He simply pointed to the spot where he had been pushed against the wall. "This station is the face of my company," Thorne said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that made the manager flinch. "I built this chain to provide a service to the community, not to act as a barrier to it. Your failure to oversee your officers and your refusal to intercede when a customer was being harassed is a breach of your contract. You are suspended pending the completion of the corporate audit." By noon, the station's exterior had been power washed. The lighting, previously set to aggressive, floodlight settings, was adjusted to be welcoming. Thorne ordered a new policy to be posted in the staff break room. Every person on this property, regardless of clothing, vehicle, or status, is a customer entitled to safety and respect. He personally met with the city's homeless liaison to establish a formal partnership. Mid-State would no longer treat the vulnerable as a nuisance to be purged. They would be treated as neighbors who needed a safe space. The trespass signs were removed, replaced by placards detailing the station's new community commitment policy. Elias Thorne had come to the station as a target, but he was leaving it as a visionary. The courtroom was sterile, smelling of wax and old paper, a stark contrast to the neon-lit, chaotic energy of the Mid-State gas station. It had been 3 months since that night. Marcus Miller sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders hunched, the authority that once defined his posture now completely dissolved. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit that seemed to highlight his sudden insignificance. Across the room, Elias Thorne sat in the front row of the gallery. He wasn't dressed in rags this time. He wore a simple, tailored navy blazer, his appearance professional and unassuming. He hadn't come for revenge, but for the closure of a chapter that had exposed the rot within a system he felt responsible for. The proceedings were swift. The evidence, the high-definition security footage, the audio of Miller's intimidation, and the documentation of his targeted harassment of transients was indisputable. The district attorney didn't need to craft a complex narrative. The facts spoke for themselves. Miller's attorney made a half-hearted attempt to argue operational necessity, but the argument crumbled under the weight of the surveillance footage, which showed Miller laughing while he escalated the encounter. When the judge handed down the sentence, the room remained silent. Miller was found guilty of official misconduct and assault. His badge, the symbol he had used to mask his prejudice, was formally revoked, and he was barred for life from any law enforcement or armed security employment. As he was led away in handcuffs, he didn't look at the judge. He looked at Elias. For a fleeting second, their eyes locked. Miller saw no hatred in Elias's gaze, only a cold, distant pity. That, perhaps, was the heaviest sentence of all. As Elias stepped out into the courthouse plaza, the sunlight felt warm and cleansing. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of urban renewal. He had fulfilled his obligation. The Mid-State chain was undergoing a massive restructuring. with new sensitivity training protocols for every employee and a partnership with local social services that turned his stations into community hubs rather than exclusion zones. He walked toward his waiting SUV, but stopped near the courthouse steps to watch a young patrol officer helping an elderly woman cross the street. The officer didn't see the woman as a nuisance. He saw her as a neighbor. Elias felt a faint smile touch his lips. He hadn't just cleaned up his own properties, he had forced a mirror in front of the department, and for the first time in a long time, they were being forced to look at who they really were. The case was closed, but the ripple effects would continue. Elias climbed into his vehicle, his mind already shifting to the next challenge, not as a victim of prejudice, but as a man who had used his own power to ensure that no one else would ever be treated as invisible on his watch again. He looked at the gas station loyalty card on his dashboard, then out at the city. The lot was quiet. The station was safe. And the man who had tried to build a kingdom on the backs of the vulnerable had finally learned the truth. Power is not in the badge, but in the integrity of the person wearing it.